Today's scripture is Psalms 4. To the leader with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. Answer me when I call, O God of my right. You gave me room when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. How long, you people, shall my honor suffer shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? But know that the Lord has set apart the faithful for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. When you are disturbed, do not sin. Ponder it on your beds and be silent. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, "Oh, that we might see some good. Let the light of your face shine upon us, O Lord. You have put gladness in my heart, more than when their grain and wine abound. I will both lie down and sleep in peace, for you alone, O Lord, make me lie down in safety." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I'm not going to tell you who it was, but when I mentioned to somebody the theme for today, they're like, well, great, instead of a sermon, are you going to let us all take a nap for 20 minutes? Like, some of you do that already. So if you want to take a nap for the next 20 minutes, you feel free. You have my blessing. All right. But we are talking about sleep, which is an interesting thing to maybe think about because it is one of those things that all people do, right? I mean, there's a handful of universal things that is a universal experience amongst all people of all time. And one of the most basics, of course, right up there with like eating and breathing is that we all sleep. And so it is something, because we do it regularly, we might not think about all that often. As we were putting this together, was thinking about a few years ago. I was visiting with my doctor, as I do on a regular basis, and he started asking me all these questions about how well I sleep. And I didn't quite understand why he was asking me, but he's like, do you take naps? And I'm like, oh, naps are lovely. I love a good nap. It's like, do you find it easy to fall asleep? And we're going through this checklist, and he's like, okay. He's like, I think we might want to sign you up for a sleep study. I'm like, why? I don't know that I like the sound of that. And he kind of explained to me why, and I was like, yeah, I'll think about that. And this is, at that time, you actually had to go to a place, and they'd wire you up with all this stuff, and then you did basically, sleep at the hospital, and they'd watch you do it. And I'm like, I don't know that I like the idea of a bunch of people watching me sleep. That feels weird. And so, as is typical for my gender, I avoided it for a long time. And my wife, being my wife, provided some gentle pressure for me every once in a while to say, you really should get this done. And I'm like, I'll think about it. I'm like, I think I'm okay. And then finally I had a small procedure done. Afterwards, the anesthesiologist came out and was talking to us and said, okay, everything went great. It was all wonderful. By the way, I did notice something. Have you thought about getting a sleep study? To which, that point, my wife looked at me and I'm like, fine. So I went and I did it. And so if you don't know, the sleep studies are there to diagnose you, to see if you have sleep apnea. And sleep apnea is basically a process by which your own body tries to kill you while you sleep. It's essentially what it's trying to do, because you're basically, while you're sleeping, your throat kind of closes up and you're not breathing properly. And so throughout the night, your body, basically your brain, has to basically microdose you with adrenaline to wake you up just a little bit so that your throat opens up and you start breathing again. You don't know this is going on because you're sleeping. And apparently, once they did the sleep study, they came back, and the technician who ran is like, okay, your pulmonologist will get a hold of you. And I said, great, well, how did it go? And he's like, your pulmonologist will get a hold of you. Quickly, I'm guessing. And no doubt it was very bad. It was very bad. And it was one of those things that once you know it, you can't unknow it. And so the standard treatment is you get a CPAP machine and you go to this place and they hook you up and you're supposed to wear this mask while you sleep, which is not in the beginning all that fun. Now, What I do have to admit also is after some, again, persistence from my wife to actually do the thing that the doctor told me to do and use the machine that they gave me, after about a week, she did look at me. She's like, how you feeling? I'm like, in the morning, I'm like, feel pretty good. She's like, oh yeah. It's like, you sleeping better? I'm like, I am. I'm like, oh, darn it, I am. Like, you're not wrong. And it was one of those moments where you don't know, like, something is bad because it's just the way things are until you find out how good it could be. And I can still remember that moment. And every time I get annoyed or frustrated that I got to carry this thing around with me when I travel and all those sorts of things, I think back about it, and I think about that first full solid week of getting first good sleep, probably in years, and thought, yeah, that feels pretty good. I really don't want to go back to the way it was before. And if any of you wives are elbowing your husbands right now, husbands, I'm sorry. But they're right. Yep, all right. But that's what it, I mean, and some of us have probably gone through that, where we've gone through a time where maybe we haven't gotten the kind of sleep, whether it's a medical thing or there's something on our mind or whatever. And we have all of these ways now of tracking our sleep. My phone is more than willing to tell me when I'm getting enough sleep and when I am not. This is the last week. I did okay. And if I wear my watch, it'll actually tell me like how much sleep I got and what kind of sleep and all got, and that just got to be too much, and it kind of freaked me out. I didn't like that, but every once in a while, my phone will actually have a little alert on it that basically says there's been a change in your sleep schedule. I'm like, not a positive one, my guess is, or you wouldn't be telling me. But sleep matters, and when we go through those periods of time when we don't get sleep, our bodies get affected by it. And in fact, there's plenty of studies now that show that sleep actually has a function. They've discovered recently that while you're sleeping, one of the things that your brain is doing is actually removing toxins out of the brain. And it can do that 3 or 4 times more efficiently while you sleep than while you are not. So your brain is literally physically healthier when you wake up than when you went to bed. And people have there's all kinds of like famous stories about famous people either sleeping or not sleeping, and that is what it is. I do think it's interesting that Einstein famously slept about 10 hours a day and took naps, because even when you're getting good sleep, naps are still awesome. You should take them, especially Sunday afternoon naps. Those are sacred. But human beings have always known this. I mean, we've always known that sleep is important, and you actually can find all sorts of references throughout even our scriptures about sleep and what sleep can do for us. Now, this is a psalm, and it's the Psalm of David, as we heard, and it's very, very early in the book of Psalms. And the book of Psalms, as we've talked about, has a lot of purposes. It's a hymn book. It's also a prayer book. And one of the things that we're fairly certain that this particular psalm was for this was a prayer to be used at the end of the day before you went to bed. If you read Psalm 3 is about basically waking up. And it's really a good prayer for the morning. Psalm 4, as we've heard, ends with David talking about going to bed and the sacred thing that sometimes is going to bed. And so here we've got David offering up a psalm that really is intended to be used that way. In the religious practice in David's day, one of the things that was coming into fashion at that time amongst God's people was this idea of having a regular prayer schedule. Basically, having a regular schedule where you did your religious activities on a regular basis. And actually in Psalm 55, another psalm of David, he talks about how evening, morning, and noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he will hear my voice. So he's basically talking about how David made a practice of in the morning, and then at noon, and then at evening before bed, making time to talk to God. And one of the ways that David talked to God was through Psalm 4. And at that time, this became a fairly regular practice amongst God's people at the time to adopt this sort of morning, noon, and night schedule of prayer. This became really important during different times, especially during the time when the Jews were in exile in Babylon, because they didn't have their temple and they didn't have access to all those sorts of things that they normally did in their religious life. So they made sure that they continued to practice their faith, and the way that they did it is they practiced it daily, morning, noon, and night. This is a practice that actually religious people would continue to have and would make its way into Christianity later. Where this becomes actually a big thing for us is actually a few centuries after Jesus. We'll get to that in a minute. Actually, I'm sorry, I read my notes wrong. We'll get to it right now. After there was a time in the first several centuries when Christianity was being practiced, it was basically practiced underground. It wasn't an official religion. It wasn't a sanctioned religion. There were times of persecution. But around the 3rd century, that ended when Christianity actually became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it kind of came out of the shadows in that way. And so all sorts of different religious practices grew up. That's when we start to see actual churches being formed, buildings being built. If you're trying to do something in secret before, you usually didn't build a building to do it in. Once Christianity became the official religion, then suddenly we needed and had churches and temples and all those sorts of stuff. And in much the same way, in David's time, those churches and temples became the center of religious life. And after a couple of centuries of that, a group of people got together and said, we need to make sure that religious life is about more than just what happens at the churches and at the temples. We want to make it, again, a daily practice. So much so that there's a group of people that actually decided to leave the towns and the places they were living, these religious leaders, and go off on their own because it was so important for them to practice their faith that they wanted to go off on their own. And some of them actually just lived alone in caves so they could regularly practice their faith on a schedule. And this became the monastic movement and gave birth to monasteries and all those sorts of things that would come later. The problem, you see, when you go and want to practice your faith as a religious leader all by yourself, is sometimes other people take interest in that and then they show up. And this happened a lot, where religious leaders would go off and they'd be like, I'm here to practice my faith by myself, and other people would come to them and they would want what they have. So they're like, we want to come and do what you do. And like, yes, but I'm here practicing my faith by myself. And like, great, we can do it by ourselves together. And out of that literally came things like monasteries and all of that. And while there's different kinds of Christian monasteries and different kinds of movements, the one thing that they have in common is there's always a regular practice of prayer. And one of the things that they definitely have in common is there's always a practice of prayer right before bed. Because it was understood at the time that the best thing that we can do is to take a moment to center ourselves, to focus on God before we sleep. And by doing so, the hope is it both had religious purposes for sure, but it also had practical purposes too, because it was a nice way to center yourself and calm your mind and be ready for and have some good sleep to follow. We see it all the way here in Psalm 4, where at the end, if you see what David says, right? He's like, I'm going to take this time to focus on you, God, and then I know if I do that, I will lay my head down and I will sleep well, because my focus won't be on the troubles of the day and it won't be on me. My focus will be on something bigger and more important, and I will get the sleep that I know that I need. Now, throughout history, there have been several times where people have discovered the importance, again, of sleep. And sleep does this amazing thing to our brains. It lets us relax. It lets us let go of things. And I don't know how many of you have had the experience where, you are working on something in the evening and you can't get it and you can't get it, you can't get it. And then you go to sleep and you wake up in the morning and the answer is just there. Right? I mean, I don't know how many times I've had that experience. Usually it's around the sermon. Like it's like something, it's not coming together and it's not coming together and it's Thursday afternoon. I'm like, it's Thursday evening and it's not coming together. I'm like, I didn't go to bed. And then I wake up in the morning. I'm like, that's right. This has happened. This happens a lot. It happens, and it's happened in some rather famous ways. About 100 years ago, there was a Russian chemist named Dmitry Medlev, and he was working on chemistry because that's what chemists do. And he was trying to organize things, and he was trying to find a way to organize all of the information that they were gathering because they were discovering at that time all these various elements and things that we didn't know about before. And he worked 3 days straight without sleep, which you should not do. Don't do that. But he worked 3 days straight without sleep, and finally basically almost collapsed into bed, slept, and when he woke up in the morning, he finally had the answer to what it is that he was looking for, and what came to his mind would be what we know today as the periodic table of elements. And so this was not exactly this, but this is one of what he came up with. And he'd been struggling with it for days. But there was something about the sleep. There was something about letting his body and his mind rest that things came into focus in a new way. And so it happens with big things like that. It happens in other smaller ways. I am not a golfer, but there apparently are many of you that are. And there's actually a rather famous story about Jack Nicklaus. And Jack Nicklaus was going through kind of a slump in his golfing career, and he went to sleep one night, and he dreamed he was actually performing much better, right? He dreamed while he was sleeping that he was playing golf tremendously better than what he was before. And when he woke up, he was thinking about that, and the thing that he realized in the dream he was doing is he was actually holding the club slightly different. And so when he got up, went immediately to the golf course and changed his grip to the grip that he was using in the dream, and it worked and it made things better. He actually gave this in an interview to Sports Illustrated, and he's like, I know this sounds stupid and crazy, and you're not going to believe me, but this is actually what happened. Sleep has this amazing ability to help us. Sometimes it's not as, sometimes it can be a little more dramatic. There was another guy, I know many of you here are into like sewing and quilting and those sorts of things, right? Again, I don't do that, but I envy you and I'm grateful for those of you who do. Well, you wouldn't kind of necessarily think about this, but the sewing machine is actually a machine that actually had to be invented somewhere along the way. And the person that invented it was a guy named Elias Howe. And he got most of it worked out. And he kind of figured out mostly how he wanted this thing to work. But there was one thing he couldn't quite figure out, and it had to do with the needle and the thread, and it just wasn't coming together the way that he wanted to. And he fell asleep one night, and in a dreamed that he was being told by some overlord guy that he needed to invent the sewing machine, and if he didn't invent it right now, they were going to execute him at dawn. Yeah, this is a great dream. And he can't figure it out. And so they literally, in the dream, come and grab him and take him off, and they're taking him to the gallows. And while they're taking him there, he notices that the guards are carrying spears, and the spears are pierced at the sharp end, not at the bottom end, which apparently is how they are on sewing machines. Wakes up and goes, that's what it is. And apparently the insight that he had and the thing that he hadn't quite figured out is he needed to move the needle from not where it normally is on a needle and thread you would use with your hands, but needed to move the eye down to the pointy end of the needle. And once he did that, then everything else fell into place. Dreams have this amazing ability. Now, there's one more that I don't recommend, and that's also that Stephen King apparently famously came up with the idea for the book Misery while falling asleep on an airplane, because sleeping on an airplane is miserable. Sleep, as it happens, is important. It's something that we have known for human beings is a long time. It is also something that is easy to take for granted. It's something to not prioritize. It's easy to be distracted by it. It's easy to think, well, I need to stay up late tonight and I will just catch up later. By the way, you won't. And it's one of those places where we have an opportunity to care for ourselves on a regular basis that most of us, or at least a lot of us, probably find it occasionally hard to do. We are made for a lot of things. One of the things that we are made to do is sleep. And sometimes that is hard. Even in this psalm, David acknowledges that. Because he says, when you are disturbed, do not sin. Basically saying when your heart is troubled, when you are anxious, when you are struggling with something, when the world or your life isn't as it is to be, or you have care or concern for yourself or others, whatever it is that is disturbing you, he says, when you are disturbed, do not sin. What he means by that is, even though you might be disturbed and anxious about what's going on, don't take that as an excuse or a reason to do things that maybe you know you ought not to do. There are plenty of times when it is easy to say, I don't feel good, I'm anxious, things aren't going to go right, so I'm going to go, and maybe it's a big thing or maybe it's a little thing, but instead of doing the thing that we probably ought to do, which is get up and take a walk or take a nap or whatever, we reach for the pint of Ben and Jerry's. Now, next week, we're actually going to talk about why maybe that's not necessarily a horrible thing. But that is what David is on about. He knows that when our souls are disturbed, when we're feeling unsettled, when we're feeling anxious, we're feeling all those things, it is easier for us to justify doing things maybe or to ourselves or others that maybe we ought not to, that are not in our own or anyone else's long-term interest. Instead, he says, ponder it on your beds and be silent. Give yourself a time to recognize and experience the feelings you are having. Instead of running away from them, usually by doing something we ought not do, take a moment, recognize that you are experiencing the feelings that you are feeling, recognize them, understand that they are there, ponder them in your bed in the silence. Something happens, and something good can happen when we actually take a moment to recognize the feelings that we are happening. Sometimes we are hit by waves. It may be waves of anxiety, waves of grief, waves of sadness. And we have a choice when those things happen. We can either try to resist the wave, which is oftentimes what leads people to drowning, or we can try to ride it and know, like all waves do, it will pass. So David is recognizing that if we do it that way, if we recognize what we're doing, willing to live into it for a moment, oftentimes what happens is it will pass. And then we have a choice about what it is that we choose to focus on next. And David recommends at the end of it that we take that choice in that moment to focus on God, God's love for us, the love we have for God, the love we have for our neighbors, and the neighbors' love we have for us. I am not immune, as none of us are, to anxiety and worry. I have had a lot to be anxious and worry about for a while. One of the things that I've had to learn how to do is at the end of the day, when not everything I needed or wanted to happen happened, when everything wasn't magically better in the way that I wanted it to be, I've learned that I have to sit down for a moment, recognize what I'm feeling, and make the conscious choice to say to myself, no, things are not all okay. No, things are not all as they should be. Yes, there are legitimate things to be anxious and worry about, and I'm going to choose now to recognize that I will think about those things and work on those things in the morning. I will trust that if they're still important, God will still have them on my heart. And in the morning, I will choose to think about them again. But for now, I'm choosing to set it aside. I'm choosing to set it aside and instead focus on something else so that I can have the sleep that I know that I need. It is a practice that oftentimes we actually have to practice. It is a conscious choice that sometimes we have to make to tell ourselves, yes, that's important, and I will come back to it in the morning, but right now, what I need to do is rest. I need to rest, and I know and trust that God wants me to rest as well. So I'm going to choose to take that time to do so. We live in an age and a time when it is harder and harder and harder to get the sleep that we need. We have so much distraction all around. David had the advantage in his time that he did not have Instagram or Snapchat or the internet or cable TV or even electric lights. David lived in a world, it got dark. And when it got dark, it got dark. And there wasn't much to do. So you might as well go to sleep. We don't live in that world. We live in a world where we can distract ourselves way into the evening, should we choose to. We can continue to scroll as long as we like and flip channels as long as we like. And for most of us, there isn't anybody around who's necessarily going to stop us from doing so. Lent is a season about reflecting on who we are, where we are spending our time, and spending some time figuring out, is that really where we want to be? One of the ways that no doubt most of us could spend a little time is thinking about something as basic as, how well am I sleeping? Am I giving myself permission to get the sleep that I need? Am I giving myself permission to set down the cares that I have, that I carry with me for a time, so that I can do so? David reminds us that when we do that, when we allow our hearts to focus on God and the love we have and we've experienced, we are not shirking our responsibilities. We are not undermining or undervaluing the hard things that we are dealing with in life. We are, in fact, doing exactly what we should do. We are doing the thing that God wants us to do. Taking the time and moment to love ourselves, to care about ourselves enough, to get the sleep that we need, so that we can, in fact, do the work in the next day that God has called us to. It may seem simple and it may seem basic. Oftentimes we actually overcomplicate things like faith and religion and all those sorts of things, or we think God doesn't care about our day-to-day lives. That is completely untrue. David reminds us of this right now. God cares so much about us and so much about our daily lives. God comes into our lives as he came into David's life with that nice, loving voice of a loving mom that reminds you, honey, get your sleep. Do you need to sleep now? All those sorts of things we tell our 5-year-olds when they're throwing tantrums. Maybe we need a nap. Sometimes that is exactly what we need. Amen.